Hey everybody, this is Ash for the Triple S League. I'm here with Jamie Catalyst, and we are going to be doing a deep dive GreedFall review for you today. We are trying this in a bit of a different format. Normally we do pre-edited, pre-written reviews, but we thought we'd try a more discussional format. We've both recently finished the game, and there's a lot to talk about. And it's already taken us longer than we wanted to get this review out, just because it is actually a surprisingly long game. And we wanted to get to the end to just get a full experience of the story and the choices and how all that works together with this game. They didn't give out pre-release review copies, so the reviews from major outlets that you may have seen shortly after the game came out, most of those were by people who were maybe 10, 15 hours in. There weren't a lot of reviews right off the bat from people who had actually finished the game. So we have now finished the game, and we both took different paths, we both built different characters, took different choices at various points. And so we wanted to sit down together and talk about all that, so we hope you enjoy this format. Of course, let us know in the discussion, or in the comments below if you did, and we might be able to do this some more in the future. Anyway, welcome Jamie, thanks so much for being here.
I'm happy to talk about this game that consumed my life for like 2 to 3 weeks.
If you're a regular on our channel, you probably recognize Jamie's voice from a number of reviews she's done. This is probably the biggest game that you've ever reviewed for us. I mean, it took a while to get through it. When all was said and done, my total playtime clocked in at 45 hours. What was yours?
47 hours.
That's actually a long time. I was surprised when I got to the end. I was like, wow, did I really just put that much of my life into this game? Now, of course, we kind of crammed it a bit because we wanted to get this review out. But one of the initial criticisms that came out about this game that I want to address because somebody on our Discord server specifically asked about it. Somebody had said that the game is overstretched. Too little game stretched over too many hours. So I wanted to address that right off the bat because we did put 45 to 47 hours into this game, and I don't feel it was overstretched. I don't know about you, but I feel like it wasn't a 10-hour game stretched over 30 hours. I feel like it was a 40 to 45-hour game stretched over 40 to 45 hours. In general, I was pretty happy with that, with the content of the game, the amount of meaningful content in the game. Now, there were a few points where I felt like, why do I have to run back and forth talking to these two people over and over again? Like, there were a few isolated points where I felt like this wasn't designed the best, this quest could have been more efficient, like, where it does feel like I'm just running to various points on the map so I can talk to one specific person and then another person so I can trigger something to happen, and it was just, it did get a little annoying, but that happened fairly rarely. I think there was about 3, maybe 4 times over the course of the entire game that I felt that way, like, why are they just stretching this out artificially? But I don't know if that was, intentional, or if there's some technical reason for it. How did you feel about that?
I didn't even think about that. I was so engrossed in the game, I didn't even think about that as a potential thing that was going on, that it was being artificially stretched, that it just had a lot of filler content. That did not even cross my mind until you had read that question from the Discord server. There was at least 1 or 2, like you're saying, 1 or 2 missions where maybe going back and forth and talking to somebody. But I remember specifically getting a kick out of the end of it because my DSarday actually mentioned that they had also felt this was ridiculous that they were having to do this, kind of like making fun of it. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm fine with this because that mate me laugh so hard that I'm like, it was worth it. I'm fine with this. They knew what they were doing. It's like they were making fun of it.
Kind of poking fun at themselves, or at least addressing it or acknowledging it as a nod to the player kind of a thing. So yeah, I agree. And I mean, a lot of it depended on what else you had going on. Like, if you had other quests to do in the same sort of general area, then stopping in to talk to some person wasn't that big of a deal. And it all kind of made sense from a story perspective, why you'd have to go talk to so-and-so. And maybe, like I said, maybe there's technical reasons for it, just to make sure, things don't break in a certain way. Maybe they have to flag you as being in a certain place or talking to a certain person. I don't know, could be. But yeah, in general, it all kind of made sense. And if you had other stuff going on in the same location, then it wasn't so bad. But I'll say, like, you get that in any RPG, though, right?
Oh, yeah.
You get that in any RPG where it's like, oh, I have to go all the way back there to talk to somebody, like...
And I mean, they were a diplomat, which is kind of what they were supposed to do to begin with, so it made a little sense. Like, hey, I'm I'm talking between these two people, trying to, set up a meeting or get them to agree with each other and make peace or get them to work together, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm. And the conversations were generally interesting. The characters were generally interesting. Like, most of them, it wasn't just like, oh, go talk to generic NPC A and then generic NPC B. There was a little bit of that, but it seemed like all of the NPCs that you talked to had characters behind, like, they had some backstory. They had a character. They had character qualities. They weren't just like generic NPCs. So I appreciated that. The conversations were typically interesting. And I will also point out that there were a few points where you had a choice. You talk to somebody and they're like, okay, let's go do this. And then the game gave you a choice. Go straight there. Or, you could make the choice to not go straight there. And then you'd eventually, you could go there at your own pace. But there were points where if you wanted to skip straight ahead to whatever you were doing with this NPC, you could just skip straight to that. So I appreciated that. It was a nice quality of life thing. They didn't have that in all circumstances, but it happened enough that it was like, okay, these game designers, they recognize you don't want to just waste a bunch of time running around for no reason. And so where they can, you just push a button and it'll take you straight where you need to go. And we should get into talking about like the world and the setting of the world right away here, but one thing I just wanted to point out about it not being a AAA game. That's important to keep in mind. This was not a AAA game, but it's as big as some AAA games of the past have been, and so it's hard not to hold it to that standard. But it is important to remember it's less than a AAA game. It was built by a relatively small studio. It was something like 30 to 40 people that worked on this game.
32 people.
32 people. So unfortunately, when you have a studio size that small and a budget that's smaller than your typical AAA studio, some corner cutting's going to happen. Some things are not going to be as smooth as say, your average game that has a $50 million budget or whatever. But it's an impressive piece of work for the size of the team that worked on it, I have to say, and especially after I got where I thought I was at the end of the game and realized later that was like the halfway point. Like, there was a few points where I thought, I must be getting near the end. And no, it was just a major turning point in the story. And there was still tons of story left after that. So I was impressed. I was very impressed with the size of the game that the studio was able to put out, but also the quality of it. And the quality of the storytelling. It was quite good.
One thing I'll just say, it kept you on your toes because I had that same feeling as well. But another thing, as you were saying with the AAA quality, and maybe taking it as it is, Team of 32, this is the third game they've ever made, and I read a headline from one of the articles that was talking about it, and it says, great RPG made on a shoestring budget. And I was like, well, there you go, that's a better article than all the other ones I've ever seen, keeping in mind, hey, it's good, but also, it didn't have the same budget as a AAA game, but they did an amazing job with what they had.
Yeah, and I think most of the limitations of the budget manifest in technical areas, and we'll get into that in a little bit here in a few minutes. They manifest mostly in technical areas. I don't feel like they pulled any punches or cut any corners where it really mattered. Characters, story, that kind of a thing. The romance quests were pretty meh, but other than that, but they are in every... I have never played a game where I'm like, wow, that had great romance quests. No, they always suck. Yeah, somebody asked about romance in our Discord server, so I'll just address that quickly here too. You can romance the companions, and it depends what whether you pick male or female, but in any playthrough you have, I believe, 3 companions of the 5 that you can romance. Some of them are straight, some of them are bi. In all cases, all it is in your personal conversations with them, you pick certain responses, and if you pick the right ones, your reputation with them goes up to the point where they decide they want to bone you. And then they're like, hey, meet me in my,
meet me in your bedroom.
Yeah, so once you go through all the dialogue options and your reputation gets to that point, then the next time you talk to them, they're like, I have feelings for you, and then you can choose, oh yeah, do you have feelings for them too? If so, meet me outside my room next time we're resting at the house. And I wanted to try and see what would happen if I romanced more than one at the same time and they both showed up at my room. I was hoping for a funny cutscene or something, but unfortunately that's not an option. Once you put the moves on one character, then that locks out all the others.
Shoestring budget, man. It's like, you gotta pay the big bucks to get the big romances and to have all that drama.
Yeah. Anyway, So it is what it is. It's a roleplay option, but it's not terribly robust.
It's extremely hollow.
All right, so let's get into the story and the setting of the world. It's a really interesting setting, actually, based on sort of colonial-era history, but it isn't set in colonial-era history. I just want to make that clear. It is a fictional world that's kind of based on ours, but it's also its own thing. You could say, there's a lot of, some of the factions and nations and things are inspired by real-world things and a real-world era in history, but it's also different. It also kind of goes in its own direction. It does address things that are relevant in the real world. But it is a fictional world, and I mean, you can see that in the obvious fact that they have magic. It's like if you took a fantasy world that then advanced technologically to the point where they have firearms and explosives and things like that, but they also still have the magic that they can use. And so that gives you 3 basic character classes you can play. You have the warrior, the technical, and the magical. And Jamie, you chose a warrior build or magical?
Yeah, I chose warrior build at the very beginning, but then by the end, I had more magic than I had, like, swordplay abilities.
Okay. I started with the technical build, and I stayed fairly true to that, except by the end I was branching into more of the warrior build. I think I'll put up a screenshot of my build here in the video, of how I allocated my skill points. The neat thing about this is that when you pick a class, you're not locked into that class, and you're not locked into certain skill trees. When you pick a class at the beginning, it determines your starting skills, and it tells you right off the bat what those are. And you covered this when you did your character creation video, which I recommend. We'll put a link to that. It determines your starting skills, and it tells you what those are. Plus, then it gives you the recommended attributes and recommended talents that you should pick. But it doesn't force you to pick those. You can pick something else. You can completely mix and match if you want. It might work, it might not work well, but if you specifically look at the skill tree here, you can see it's arranged in a circle. And at the top you have the warrior skills, at the bottom left you have technical, and bottom right you have magical. It all blends together in a circle. Like, there's some skills that are like halfway between technical and warrior, halfway between technical and magical, that kind of a thing. And so as I was branching out into my technical build here, and sort of the apex of the technical build, way down on the bottom left, is the bomb, which was an awesome skill. Just destroys enemy armor. It's from a distance. Like, Desarde tosses this thing, and then he shoots it with his pistol, and it blows up, and it's got this wide radius, especially after you max out your skills with it. Just destroys enemy armor. It was awesome. And then your companions. And so I normally I had Kurt and Siora. And I picked Siora because she's a healer, and Kurt because he's a strength build, and so he could use the heavy hammers that would also destroy armor. And that was really important. When you're in the combat of the game, when your enemy has armor, you do very little damage to them, but once you destroy that armor, they become a lot more vulnerable to your attacks. And so I'd be setting traps, which I achieved a certain skill where you could, instead of just setting these concoctions as traps, you could throw them. And so they were like grenades. I also had the bombs, and I put skills into firearms, so I was doing a lot of ranged damage and a lot of area of effect damage, especially when it came to bringing down the armor value. And then I'd have Siora in there, and I gave her a really good sword that had very low armor damage, but once the armor was gone, she could take down enemies really fast. Kurt had massive armor damage, but he could also swing that hammer. It also did a lot of regular damage as well. So that was kind of my build going into it. And so this is a system where you can really mix and match. You can pick your skills and then pick companions to fight by your side to sort of complement you in the areas where you're not as skilled. I really liked that. With your warrior magic build, like who did you usually pick as your companions for combat?
Well, and here's the thing, I was never really strategic about it, because most of the time whenever I would go on certain missions, I would just bring people I thought had the most input, that would have the most to say about these missions, instead of thinking combat-wise. So I changed out people pretty frequently, honestly. But I knew if I was ever going into a big mission, I would pick Sior because of healer, and then I would also pick Vasco. Mainly because, for some reason, whenever I would take people into missions, those were the 2 people that would last the longest with me, that would actually hold out the longest and do the most damage, just by me watching them. Not necessarily thinking strategically, but just by me noticing that they would actually stay alive long enough to do anything. Because for me, magic ignores armor. So whenever I was using magic, I didn't have to worry about armor.
Oh, that's the other thing. Yeah, that's the other reason why I picked Siora, because she has the magic attack as well.
Another thing, Vasco would use his firearms more than anything else. And firearms also do really good against armor. Something that's why he would always actually stay alive longer than Kurt in my group, because I would always actually take a step back and just be blasting magic, which there was some pretty cool magical abilities whenever you were unlocking them along the tree, and then some combinations of magical abilities and warrior abilities and technical abilities, because I unlocked almost nearly all of them. I still would have liked some better variety, but with what I unlocked, I think one of my last abilities that I unlocked was a type of shadow dash that was really helpful for dodging. Especially whenever you started fighting those bigger enemies that could pretty much leap across the entire map to get you, and you'd only have like a few seconds to dodge it before they would take half your health. Shadow dash, I could be in one area and then another, and I always thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I had something similar. Like I had the roll dodge, which was very important because I put almost no points into endurance. And actually, I'll switch over to the attributes here. You can see my attributes were. By the way, if you're not familiar with how the skill trees work in this game, you have 3 different types of skill points, and you get points in these trees. Every level you get a skill point, and then every X number of levels you get an attribute point. Every X number of levels you get a talent point. I think it's every 5 levels for a talent point. So you have skills, attributes, and talents. So attributes are things like strength, agility, accuracy with firearms. You have willpower and mental abilities, which are important for magic use. And then you have endurance, which is your ability to use armor. It affects how many hit points you have. So until the end of the game, I didn't put anything in endurance. I maxed out agility and I maxed out accuracy to use, one-handed blades and firearms, and got really strong with those. But I was pretty squishy if I got hit, especially by some of the bigger enemies and bosses. It wasn't until the end when I had a few attribute points just sitting there in my bank, and I was like, well, what am I going to spend these on? I was coming up to the final battle. I was like, well, I'll put them in endurance, so it'll give me a little more survivability, a few more hit points, right? But that's the only reason I have any points in endurance.
Ditto for me. I did not put anything in endurance whatsoever. I just put a lot of money into armor, which didn't help a ton, but it definitely helped some whenever you don't really have a lot of endurance, making up for it by having some pretty high-level, expensive armor on. Yeah, and I was pretty squishy too, which, like I said, that's why the Shadow Dash came in handy, and I feel like the Shadow Dash is way cooler than the action roll. Just my opinion.
Oh, I'm sure it probably is, but you probably have to, you'd have to build out that skill tree before you can get that skill, right?
Yeah, it was kind of like a final ability.
So a lot of different ways you can go with it. Now, I didn't put any in strength either. Usually I put points in strength in a lot of games. I put points in strength just for the carry weight, but I had almost no trouble with carry weight. I think there was twice in my entire playthrough that I got over encumbered.
Yeah.
My carry weight just went up and up throughout the game anyway, so, I'd be carrying 7 pieces of armor and a bunch of weapons and still have... So they were very generous with the carry weight. But anyway, let's quickly talk about talents. So talents are more things you can do as opposed to the passive attributes. So the talents include science, which I did quite heavily. That lets you craft bombs and use them in certain ways. Charisma, which affects how well you do in certain conversations, as well as how well your companions do in combat. There's intuition. Now, some of these, like intuition and science, they actually have profound effects on the gameplay. It's same with vigor. Vigor allows you to climb and cross certain things to actually get to areas that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. Now, I didn't find any areas that I was not able to get to. Usually there's multiple ways of getting everywhere. But I could see it being possible if you don't have any science, vigor, or intuition. There might be a few places you can't actually get to. There might be a skill altar or two that you can't get to. Skill altars, by the way, they're like these shrines you can find in the world that give you a skill point. Kind of like the places of power in Witcher 3, if you're familiar with that. So, I don't know for sure if you could ever get locked out of any part of the game 100%, but there's a lot of times where you can take shortcuts if you have these, or you can avoid a bunch of enemies. When you're in certain caves and things, there's little passages you can slide through that you can only use if you have high enough intuition, which surprised me. Intuition is a little bit OP, in my opinion. If you want to have an easier playthrough in terms of conversations, definitely put a lot of talent points in intuition, because it gives you a lot of solutions to dialogue situations that doesn't require a charisma roll. And it's like basically a guaranteed success, because you just kind of know what to say to influence this character. So really cool. Might be a little overpowered, but it also lets you see certain passages that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. Science also lets you blast holes through certain walls, and Vigor lets you like cross certain bridges and climb things that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. So they offer some convenience, but intuition definitely affected the gameplay quite heavily. What were your preferences as far as talents?
I'm the type of person that usually, whenever I have any character whatsoever in any style RPG, whether tabletop or not, always puts a ton of points in charisma. And I feel a little bad because I don't think maxing out charisma in this game mattered that much, but it made me feel better because my character's a diplomat, and with maxed out charisma, I know I talk good. But I know I think I had 2 points in intuition, and I didn't even realize that intuition allowed you to find paths. Had no idea about that whatsoever. But I was appreciative of the fact that I would get myself into trouble sometimes, and then it was like, okay, your charisma's not high enough to convince this person of this, but hey, you have magical intuition where you kind of know something maybe you shouldn't, and you can convince them using this information.
Yeah.
So yeah, intuition definitely was extremely helpful, but mainly for me it was charisma. I didn't put any science down, but I was able to use and make certain things that was level 1 science, because I had that little pouch that you could put on your armor. And if I'd upgraded that pouch, I would have had even more levels of science without actually having ever taken it and been able to make more. But I just always had the level 1 pouch, so I could make a few things here and there, which I thought was a really interesting mechanic, honestly, that you could make little things to go on your armor to kind of fill in the gaps.
Modifiers, basically, yeah, and actually that's a good point. You can see on the screenshot I have up here, some of them are grayed out, but they have that little plus symbol at the bottom. That means you haven't put a point into that talent, but you have a modifier that's bumping it up 1 level. So I actually have maxed out lockpicking here, because there's a slot on most armor pieces, like your main body armor, where you can craft a little doodad or pouch, like Jamie was saying, that gives you a talent modifier. And so I picked, for a while I had one that was like craftsmanship or something, and then I switched over to that being lockpicking. So I have maxed out lockpicking without putting 3 points into lockpicking here. So that's one thing I noticed, is that there's really no reason to ever max out any of your talents, like putting 3 points into them. You can put 2 points into them and then gain a modifier that bumps it up that 3rd point, either by having something on your armor or by the friendship bonuses of your companions. So if you get your companions up to where they're friendly with you, they give you a friendship bonus, and if you have that companion in your party, you get, a +1 modifier to that talent. For example, like Afra's is science, Siora's is vigor. Each companion has a different one. The only one that you can't get from a companion benefit is lockpicking. So that's why I crafted, like I said, the doodad that goes on my armor that gives me the +1 to lockpicking, because the rest of the other 5 you can get through a companion bonus. But you only get that perk, you only get that modifier if that companion's actually in your party, like they're one of the 2 that you're bringing with you. So you can swap them out and get different modifiers for your talents if you need them in certain situations.
The true definition of friends with benefits.
Oh, one final thing I'll say about this is you can get memory crystals, which allow you to completely respec all your points in all your skill trees. And as you can see, I've got 6 here. I used 1. You get 1 right after you finish the prologue to the game. You get 1, and I used 1 right at the beginning. Other than that, I didn't use any. But if you get partway through the game and you want to completely respec, become a completely different type of character, you can do that. So that's a really cool thing. All right, anyway, I think we should bring it back to talking about the world and the setting just a little bit, and the story to some extent, because we went off on that tangent talking about all the RPG stuff. But yeah, the setting.
Friends.
Yeah, the setting's quite interesting, it was nice to have sort of a more unique setting with factions that, aren't your typical RPG factions. It was kind of a breath of fresh air, honestly.
It was to the point for me that I was so interested in the different groups of people, the different factions, what everybody did, the different setting of the world, that I actually ended up asking everybody all the available questions just because I was so curious. And I love the fact that if you do that, you get called out on it. Literally, there are like different, especially with the group of the natives and the different tribes of the natives. There was one person in particular that had all these questions I could ask, and then I got to ask two of them, and they're like, "Why you ask so many questions? I don't want to answer anymore." And I'm like,
"You're done, yeah."
Ah! I just thought that was hilarious, because that's literally how I'd been going throughout the entire game, just asking everyone everything. And then I ran into two different people that got really upset at me for doing that. The game knows. So, but yeah, the setting was so interesting. I just wanted to learn everything I possibly could about it. But for me, I get really interested in lore of just about everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like how they sort of navigated the whole colonialism thing, with it being more loosely inspired, but not too close that it's sort of cringy. They kind of, they skirted a line a bit, but the world setting was definitely incredibly interesting and very different, because I don't think colonialism is something any other fictional or fantasy universe has ever really kind of stepped onto, because it's a sensitive one, and I don't understand why, but in my opinion, I think they handled it relatively well, and I just thoroughly enjoyed the world that they created.
I agree. It was really interesting learning the histories and interests of all these different factions and how they all converge on this new island that has just been discovered, and how it and there's some history and backstory there that we won't spoil, but not everything is as it seems when you first get to the island. Let's just put it that way. There's some mysteries and some questions they start getting you as the player asking right off the bat, but very subtly. But also the interactions between these two, like so your faction, the Congregation of Merchants, is allied with these two other major factions, Taleme and the Bridge Alliance, but they're at war with each other, and they're both have conflicts with the natives. And then you have the Coin Guard, who are they're kind of like mercenaries. There's this faction of guards that basically they contract out to all these different nations for protection and things like that. And that creates, there's some interesting things that happen in the story with that, which I don't want to spoil that part, because it was a really cool part of the story. And that event depends heavily on how you've treated, your one companion that is allied with that faction, Kurt, who's allied, he's part of the Coin Guard. And that's another interesting thing. You get one companion from each of these factions. And so there's a lot of different dynamics at play, and it's really interesting. And you have a reputation value with each companion, but you also have a reputation value with each faction. And that affects how the story goes, and that affects how things go at the end of the game. Your general reputation value. When I got to the end of the game, I did one thing. I made one choice. I won't tell you what it is, but I made one choice that dropped my reputation with the Bridge Alliance by 10 points in one fell swoop.
Oh.
So they were suspicious of me at the end of the game. I had gotten them all the way up to friendly, and I dropped back to suspicious because of one thing I did. So when it came to the end of the game, and it's like, well, will you help us with this massive thing? No. Get out of my throne room.
Oh, they told you no?
Yep.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So
I worked so hard to make everyone love me. At the end of the game, I had friendly with everyone. My companions, all of the factions, except for, ironically, the Congregation of Merchants, which I'm not going to spoil anything, but this is something, a mechanic that I found incredibly interesting. So, usually in RPGs, obviously what you do will affect your relationship with the factions and the characters, but some of the things that happen, instead of it being something you did to make them suspicious of you, it's the other way around. The faction did something and now you are suspicious of them. And I thought that was incredibly interesting, and I'd never seen anything like that before. Like, hey, you did something? I'm not a big fan of you anymore. Like, oh, well, okay then. It's a really cool mechanic that makes a lot of sense to me that maybe should have existed even before this point, where you have a relationship and they can just as easily do something to make you not like them as you do something to make them not like you.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, you don't know what they're entirely up to, if they're telling you the truth. And you do have to make some tough decisions at some points, like, am I going to sort of support and try to be friendly with these people because they can help with something really important down the road, or because I need something from them right now? Or am I going to take like an ethical stance and be like, no, you guys suck, and not help them, and that's going to come with consequences? That's what really makes it an RPG. It is a role-playing game. You're playing the character as you want to play the character. It's not so much winning and losing the game. There's no right path that, you win or you lose. Now, there are consequences as far as how the ending goes, depending on how friendly you are with various factions, but it can be a tricky thing to navigate at times. And so, like I said, I made a decision on principle that dropped my reputation with the Bridge Alliance. Just, it bottomed out.
I think because of the setting itself, they really brought their A game with some of the more realistic and maybe harder scenarios that would come with this setting also in the real world, where you had an abundance of different choices and paths that you could have taken, but they're like real life choices. So for this game, I think it is because of the setting maybe that brought out these harder decisions that all had consequences. And I think it's also really interesting that whenever it comes to, for my opinion on this segment in particular, the choices of RPGs, I feel like this one in particular had me thinking a lot more deeply and a lot longer about some of my choices on certain circumstances, certain things going on, than probably any other RPG I've ever played, because of the setting and because of what's going on that was influenced, inspired by that setting.
Right.
It was a little bit more profound in the way that it wasn't just, oh, the mages, what are we going to do about the mages? At any one point, I feel like your choice actually affected more than just one faction. It affected several at any one point, which made it even harder and made it far more interesting.
It wasn't always a cut and dried, this person's good, this person's evil. Every faction was a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them were doing awful things in the name of a greater good. Some of them were doing good things for skeevy reasons. You have one companion who you find out is kind of a really kind of a slimy character, but then it turns out he's the only person that can help you with something that's really important as far as a personal quest and your personal story as a character. And then, they seem like they want to make amends for past mistakes, but you're not sure if you can trust them. And so lots of fascinating stuff like that. The story was top notch in my opinion.
And with that depth of layering of storytelling going back to it, I think the reason why some of the times the whole, it's not a black and white circumstance, because right out the gate, like you had mentioned earlier, we have this disease that is affecting so many people, and we have people of these factions that probably have loved ones that have either died from this disease or have this disease, so everybody is willing to do whatever it takes, whether that be maybe a not good decision, or maybe, a really terrible one, or an okay one. They are willing to do whatever it takes to find a cure for this disease. And whenever you take humanity and desperation and you shake them in a box full of a bunch of different things, you get a very volatile, chemical little setup there that can mean that anything can happen.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the world itself and how it's built, I thought it was really well done. And, there's a lot of different areas to explore, and a lot of it is wilderness, but I didn't find, it was all very interesting. Exploring in this game was interesting. There was new stuff to find. You'd find villages, you'd find bandit camps, you'd find various things that, you weren't expecting. And so I didn't ever get bored when I was just running around exploring. But I did find that, exploration in some cases, I wouldn't say it's pointless, but aside from like the skill altars, those are kind of a side thing that you have to look for yourself. Aside from those, there wasn't much to find that you wouldn't find later anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it seemed like every part of the map, they were eventually going to send you to for one quest or another. Now, that didn't mean that exploring was pointless, because, you could go there, check it out, get familiar with it. There might be a point where you could set up a camp, and then, when you have to go back there later, then you can just fast travel to it. So that was kind of helpful in a lot of areas. You could go about it either way. As soon as you get to one section of the map, you could explore the whole thing, or you could just go where you need to go and then get out and then, go explore it later. Yeah, it's kind of up to you how you do that, but anything that was an area of interest, they immediately marked with a question mark on the map, so you knew if there was interesting stuff there or not. I don't know how you feel about that. I guess I kind of wish there had been more exploration that you could do just to find stuff that wasn't part of a quest necessarily, but like just to find interesting things, maybe find interesting people, or maybe find people that give you little quests or something, or cool loot. Again, limitations of a lower budget game. There were a few annoying points where it looks like you should be able to walk somewhere and it doesn't let you. Like, there's boundaries built in. It looks like you should be able to walk between those trees, but you can't. So it took some getting used to checking the map and seeing, okay, this is where the boundary is. And you can't always tell this part that it's not going to allow you to walk through. Looking at the map, you can't always tell if that's like a mountain or just a thick grove of trees, or if it's a body of water. So it took some getting used to reading the map and whatnot. And there might be a bit of frustration with just having your character run in place because you're trying to navigate through something that looks like you should be able to walk through, but you actually can't. So that's one area where I can see people getting frustrated, and I did get frustrated with it a little bit. But for the most part, quite appreciated the design of the world.
I was just going to say the exact same thing. We've kind of been singing the game's praises at this point. I wanted to point out something while we're talking about maps. I got extremely frustrated with some of the layouts of some of the sort of environments in certain areas, because you can just imagine my D-Star day looking at the map, looking down, looking at the map again. It's just like, okay, how do I get here? How do I actually get to that area to find that thing? There was one mission in particular where this was the frustration of the way the map was built in particular, and me trying to figure out how I get from one place to another. I looked for 30 minutes, and then I left that mission, and I came back to it way later, and then finally I gave up and watched somebody else's video about the mission, and I'm like, what? I didn't even see that path. There was a whole path I didn't even see. And it was very frustrating. I didn't run into that issue very much, but there were definitely some map constructs that I was not a fan of. Other than that, the world is very beautiful.
Yeah, it is very beautiful. The other annoyance was that there was places that were cut off, but it wasn't indicated on the map that it was cut off. And so you'd say, oh, I'm going to go explore up there. And so you go down this one path, and then there's like boulders or something in the way. Later on in the game, that path would open up for you because there's a quest to do there or something. But it wouldn't indicate on the map that you couldn't get through there right away. Also, in terms of layout and as far as like concentration of fast travel points and stuff, it was fairly well done. There was usually, a fast travel point nearby wherever you needed to be. Even if you could stay on one section of the map, you could basically insta-warp to a different camp that was closer to your objective if you needed to. Just traveling one camp to another. So that was helpful. It wasn't a ton of just like running around to get places. There was some. And there were a few points where it got a little tedious. It happened relatively infrequently.
There was also the carriage.
Yeah, there was the caravans you could use as well.
I never took it though.
Neither did I.
So I don't know if maybe it would have cut back on that or not.
Maybe. I think to travel to the central hubs, but where it got a little annoying was like, okay, you have to go see, your cousin who's the leader of the merchant congregation, or you have to go see the leader of the Teleme or the leader of the Bridge Alliance. And so you warp to your house in that city, which was a fast travel point. And then you leave your house, and you have to run up this huge staircase to get into the palace, and you have to run across this huge lobby, then up another staircase, and then across this gigantic throne room. And this is another complaint that people had, that some of the building assets were reused, and all of the palaces in the different cities were the same layout.
They were. They definitely were, but...
It was a little immersion breaking, but at the same time, it was kind of like, I get it. You know, these palaces were huge. Like, there was all kinds of different areas you could go through, and I guess they just didn't have the resources to design 3 or 4 separate ones, but they were decorated differently enough that they kind of felt like different buildings, and...
They even had different lighting. Like, they tried their best to make it look as different as possible without having to do a complete design of, like, 4 different major, huge buildings.
Yeah. And there's a part of my brain that wonders, like, how much time would that really have taken? But then another part of my brain that was like, well, maybe they were just all designed by the same architect who just reused his plans. Like,
I mean, that's what I thought. Literally, whenever I was in the world, that made sense to me. Like, oh, these buildings are all the same. Well, this is just, you know, the most popular style of architecture that the rich and the influential can afford to use, so they all use it, because it's in style.
All of the house interiors were basically the same. Of course, you don't go into houses that often, so I barely noticed it. And also warehouses. There's like 2 or 3 different designs of warehouses that you'd see repeated now and then, but ultimately, like, yeah, it was a little immersion breaking, but at the same time, it was not that big a deal to me. Might be more of a big deal to other people. If that bothers you, then maybe that's a couple points off for the game. So it's fair to mention it, but I don't know. It really didn't bother me that much. But when you're out in the world, there at no point, like, there's places where you're exploring ruins and things. At no point do I recall seeing like reused assets and reused layouts when you're sort of in the overworld. When you're exploring in the wilderness, or when you're exploring some ruins or caves or that kind of a thing. Anytime we went in a cave, it was like, okay, it seemed like it was a new layout.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know that with 100% certainty, but I at no point was I like, oh, it's this cave again, so I know exactly where to go. One thing that I did feel was repetitive, though, was just tromping through the wilderness and then fighting the same types of creatures over and over again.
Yeah, a lot of other people talked about that as well, that being something that they had an issue with. Like, they even started avoiding the creatures because it's the same type of creatures over and over again. And yeah. I agree that isn't, especially since combat is a very important part of this game in particular. Having to fight the same enemy over and over again is a little annoying. But for me, once again, I was thinking story-wise, these are just the creatures that are native to this biome in particular, and there's not going to be a ton of really big, scary, predatory creatures in one biome to begin with.
It does make some sense. I would have liked some variety to it, like, say, these different herds of creatures move around a little bit, so they're not just always in the same spot when you go to a certain part of the map. Again, might have been technical limitations, I don't know. But I mean, there was also, like, there were other things in the world. Like, there were foxes running around, you'd encounter big deer that would see you and they'd run away, and you could hunt them. The world did feel kind of alive. Anyway, this is a good segue into talking about combat, though. How did you like the combat and how that worked out?
Sometimes I'm afraid to be honest about how I feel about combat, because sometimes there's combat that I like that a lot of other people really don't like. But for me, I definitely enjoyed the combat, but it did kind of feel like it was up to you how interesting the combat was going to be. Because as a magic user, just tossing these sort of fireball-like things over and over and over and over, and never branching out to any other different type of combat style, that got a little repetitive and boring. I feel like magic definitely could have been much more varied than it was. But they definitely tried. I mean, if you worked really hard on unlocking all the different types of magic, there was definitely some pretty interesting things. And if you wanted to be strategic about it, if you wanted to be really interesting about the way you encountered combat, you could have made it really interesting. But it definitely felt like it was sort of up to the player how much fun you were going to have with combat. And that's why I did magic and swordplay, because there were moments where, all right, I'm out of magic. I don't want to use any of my stored up magic potions, so I'm just going to run over there and I'm going to stab it.
Just get stabby.
But I still did enjoy combat. I did it so much, and there was never one point really where I was like, well, I'm sick and tired of combat, I don't want to do this anymore. And some of my favorite games, like with the Dragon Age series, I'm not a fan of that type of combat where it's queued. Like, hey, I pressed square, and as soon as it's my turn, I'll attack him. In this game, it's always more direct. It's direct action. And I've always liked that style of combat way more, so this was like my favorite game series, but with combat that I actually liked.
Well, that's good. Yeah, it's real-time combat, but you do have the tactical pause.
Which was so awesome, actually.
Yes, it was. And so I loved the combat in this game, actually. At first, I was skeptical about it, but I wound up loving it because you could play it in so many different ways, and you had the option to pause and consider a strategy. Like, okay, Siora's running that way, and, Kurt's over here with his armor-bashing hammer. And so, Siora's running at this one creature, so I'm going to blast that one with something to take out its armor, and then she can kill it as soon as she gets there, and that kind of a thing. Or, I'm going to lay traps here and here because these creatures are going to probably come over this way. There's just all different kinds of ways you could do it. You could play it really strategically like that, or you could just go in there sword swinging and, tossing explosive potions and kind of wing it. And I changed it up. Like, I did it different ways depending on what enemies we were fighting. Like, there were some and that's one thing, we kind of complained about the having the same creatures over and over, but there were a decent variety to the creatures.
Just maybe not. Like, some of them were much more rare than others. So there was decent variety, but you didn't run across some of the more interesting ones too terribly often, and I think maybe we could chalk it up to they didn't want to put some of their tougher creatures out just in the middle of nowhere sometimes, so that you could explore at early levels if you wanted to without getting murdered.
There were these bear-like creatures that they had no armor at all, but then you'd come across these things that had like super hard armadillo shells, and they'd roll up and roll at you and bash you, and they had massive armor. And so you'd have to train it.
Spit acid, so some of them had different types of attacks.
Exactly, and so there was variety there, even in the creatures. And of course, when you're fighting human characters, there was a ton of variety. And you'd have magic users, you'd have all of the different things that you could pick as a player character. And so you'd have to change up your strategy. And there's different difficulty levels too. There's the really easy mode, which is more for if you're just interested in the story and want to have really easy combat. But then you could also turn it all the way up to like extreme difficulty, and then you'd have to play it really carefully, really strategically, really min-max your character, pick your companions carefully, and maybe even, swap things out for each individual battle. I could see that being the case. I didn't play it on that difficulty. I played normal difficulty through the whole thing.
I did too.
Even so, there were some pretty challenging battles.
Oh, yeah.
And if you crank up the difficulty, it could be as difficult as you want it to be, basically. And you could play it as strategically as you want it to be. And then, well, maybe if you're playing on super high difficulty and you're running low on resources, well, maybe you want to sneak past this group of animals instead of fighting them. Or maybe you don't want to take on that bandit camp right away. That kind of a thing. So, but the Nadag, fighting the Nadag was always cool. I loved the Nadag fights, the big mythical creatures that exist on the island. And you get to learn all about them and where they came from, which was really awesome as well. They were kind of boss fights and mini-boss fights, but especially when I was fighting a Nadag plus some other creatures at the same time, those were the best fights. Those were awesome. The arena fights were also really cool.
Oh yeah.
I wish there were more of them. So yeah, combat really good, but also if you're not into the style of combat, you could crank down that difficulty and just play it for the story aspects of the game. But you'd still have to engage in the combat. There is some stealth option. Like, the stealth is not hugely robust, but it is there, so you can sneak past, do sneak attacks. But you cannot avoid combat completely. There are some fights, especially like I said, the boss and mini-boss fights that are not optional. So you do bear that in mind. You cannot do a pacifist run in this game.
But with that in mind, with what you said about the companions, that's sort of another thing that could be hit on. The companions in this game are actually reliable within combat and aren't just there to make snarky comments. Although, I have to admit, one other little nitpick of mine is I wish they wouldn't tell me to take potions. so often, and they wouldn't say it's getting dicey as often as they do. But I did see some, like, beta footage at some point, I feel like, and they used to say it a lot more often, so they definitely dialed it back, but still, they could have dialed it back more, because I don't need to hear that companion yell that same exact thing over 6 or 7 times in us fighting. I get it. You had poison on your blade. Can you just please shut up?
Yeah.
But it's just really nice that your companions were actually really useful in combat, especially if you make them really good weapons and really good armor and kind of just sit back a little bit, because they were actually helpful and useful in combat instead of just yelling at you like in a lot of other RPGs I've played. For me, the thing that bugged me above all was the controls, because, like, the camera is definitely a little wild. It would kind of go a bit stir-crazy. I had to turn my camera sensitivity down to the lowest it would go, just so every time I would need to look somewhere else, it wouldn't spin like my head was on a stick. And then the movement controls also felt a little slippery, but I kind of got used to that over time. But those were the only 2 things overall that bugged me the most about the entire game.
The camera didn't bug me, except that if I was running for a long period of time, or if I started sprinting, the camera would, like, level out and change its vertical angle, which I didn't like, because I was like, I set it how I want it to be, but it would kind of automatically shift downward to show you what was more ahead of you. So it was trying to be helpful, but I didn't like it. I wish there was an option to switch that off. Actually, there might be an option to switch that off that maybe I didn't see it, but I found that this is a game that's built for using a controller. Definitely. I mean, you can use mouse and keyboard, but I didn't see much advantage to using mouse and keyboard, because there's no precise aiming you have to do. Like The Witcher 3, I played that with a controller as well, because you're running around in third person. And like The Witcher 3, the running around was a little janky.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
There's an acceleration and a stopping period, and sometimes it's like, okay, when you're trying to change directions, well, Desarde actually has an animation of turning around, and so it takes a little while to get used to that, but overall, I found it way less janky than The Witcher 3.
Geralt really loved running into walls for some reason. Just like
running into walls, jumping off cliffs. So yeah, we didn't have any of that in, like, at no point did Desarde run off a cliff and die. I don't even know if there was fall damage in the game.
I don't think so.
There were specific points where you could jump down, and you could jump a fairly long distance, and you didn't take damage. But you couldn't just jump off of any random cliff. Like, there was a barrier there that stopped you from going to the cliff edge. So take that for what it is. You know, The Witcher 3's world was definitely more open in that way. But the GreedFall world, you know, it has its advantages and disadvantages. Like we said earlier, sometimes there's points on the map where it looks like you should be able to run through there, but you actually can't, and so you have to find a way around. So it's a little janky in that aspect. But while we're on the topic, let's talk about a couple more of the technical things. This is where I think the game would get most of its criticism, and it's where I would give it most of its criticism if I was judging it on the same standard as, say, a game with a AAA budget. You may agree or disagree, but I feel like it's fair to account for the fact that it was made by a smaller studio with a smaller budget, and that they did a really good job with what they had. They put together a solid RPG with a solid story, and so I'm more than willing to forgive a lot of the technical jank. But to be fair, you know, to have a fair and balanced review, I feel like we do need to at least talk about it. And so the animations are kind of jittery. Yeah. And there's some clipping issues. That's one area where they could have been improved technically, just to look a little better, because they're kind of jittery. But that said, like, the actual core of the animations, like the actual movements of the characters, felt really, really realistic, really well done. Like, the walking animations look natural. I would be surprised if they did not use motion capture for this. The gross movements, like the actual character movements, I thought were quite well done, but the finer movements, they're kind of jittery and whatnot, and the facial animations looked really weird. Like, I got used to them after a while, but the facial animations the lip syncing is really good as far as, like, the mouth actually syncing up to the letters, but the animations themselves looked really strange.
The cape was one thing that did bug me as well, especially since it feels like that is a traditional garb that character in world would be wearing, and most of the time, especially during cutscenes, that cape was inside my body.
Yes, it did have some clipping issues, yeah. Like, the animation of the cape was decent when you're running around and stuff, but it would clip inside of things you were wearing and stuff like that. Anyway, so yeah, there's some technical jank. There are some limitations. Like I said, the stealth, for example, is not terribly robust. It's there, but it's not robust. There's a few other areas of the game where it's like, okay, you can see where if they'd had more team members or a larger budget, they could have fleshed this out more. It would have made it just that much richer. But overall, considering the team size and the budget they had and that kind of a thing, I thought this game was a magnificent piece of work. And for me, if you were looking for a pretty robust third-person single-player RPG, I can wholeheartedly recommend this game. Now, you might feel like with some of the technical problems, maybe it's not worth the full price. That's up to you. I bought it at full price. I don't feel like I got ripped off. 45 hours of gameplay at that sort of $50 American price point seems like a decent value to me. Plus, like, if I have time, I'm going to do a second playthrough and play Disarde completely differently. I want to be kind of a dick to everybody and see what happens if I don't do, if I don't help the companions, if I don't do what the various factions want. I want to see how that changes the story. So my final thoughts on this are, it is a really good value game. What do you think, Jamie?
I very wholeheartedly, absolutely recommend it. And for me, I wouldn't even think about the price that much. Whenever I buy an indie game, I'm just like, okay, it costs what it costs, but I'm mainly buying it at full price to support that indie company because I'm enjoying what they're doing and I want to see them continue to create and design more as the small company that they are. And I would love to see more GreedFall from them. So that price is not that big a deal to me whenever I know it's going towards something that I would appreciate. And for me, if you are a Dragon Age fan or a BioWare fan, Mass Effect Dragon Age, mainly Dragon Age though, I very highly recommend this title because if you miss Dragon Age, like I do so much, playing it just feels like coming home after you didn't think there was going to be a home anymore because you thought it was the end. So, very highly recommend it.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, sub, and hit that notification bell, and then check out some of these other videos. Find the link to our Discord server and other important stuff in the description below.